Well, hello everyone. It's another episode of the Transform Your Birth podcast. And I've been itching, absolutely itching to get this gorgeous woman on today, Kirsten Small, who has a wealth of information and has dived very, very deeply into some powerful issues around birth. And the one we're going to focus on today is around monitoring our babies and keeping them safe and well through the birth process. And Kirsten's looked at this issue quite extensively. So, welcome. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Tracy.
Kirsten, tell our listeners a little bit about your background and, yeah, how you got to be exploring these different issues.
I've trained and worked as an obstetrician for many years and in a vast array of ways of doing that. I've been in private practice, I've worked in the public sector, I've worked as a locum, I've been in tiny little country hospitals, I've been in tertiary hospitals.
Wow.
I've worked in education roles at universities, and I am a researcher. So I did a PhD and finished back in 2020, and the focus of that was on fetal monitoring. Um, the I grew up, medically speaking, in an era when people had just discovered the concept of evidence-based care, and the idea that as it was panning out in my life, instead of me going and having to ask one of my bosses, what's the best way to manage X? And they would have an opinion. And then you'd ask a different boss and they would say, well, I prefer to do this, that, and the other. The idea was that I could go to the library and read a pile of research and come up with the best way to approach a particular problem. And it wasn't really groundbreaking because people had been doing research for a reason, but it was a fundamental shift in people's thinking. And so I grew up strongly believing that we were consistently going to make maternity care better because people would do good research and clinicians would go, that's great, let's do the thing that the research says works. And of course, when it came to fetal monitoring, I kept waiting for practice to align with the evidence. It never did. Um, and my
Interesting.
my understanding of what the evidence was incomplete, and I didn't even realise that at the time, because I just learnt the stuff that I had been taught as a trainee that look, CTG monitoring doesn't work for women who are at low risk, but it's absolutely essential for women with risk factors. It saves babies' lives and prevents them from having brain injury. And I'd been in private practice as an obstetrician for many years when I was seeing a couple. She had a twin pregnancy, and they were quite keen to have a very low-key physiological approach to their care. And I went through my usual list of, and of course I would recommend that you have continuous CTG monitoring through your labour. And her partner said, do you mind sending us some research that shows that that actually improves outcomes? And I hold, hold my beer. I'll be back in a minute. I said, I don't have anything right now. Give me a day or two and
Yeah.
I'll email you some research. I was thinking this will be easy. Like
Mm.
I had a master's at that stage. I knew my way around academic libraries. So finding research online was an easy thing for me. And I thought this will be straightforward.
Oh
Couldn't
dear.
find anything. Nothing.
Oh dear.
Nothing. And now I know because now have a very comprehensive knowledge of the research basis. There has never ever been a study that looks at whether CTG monitoring is better than another form of fetal monitoring in labour for women with a multiple pregnancy. It just didn't exist. And so I had to eat humble pie and email them and go, this just seems to be one of those things that people think is a good idea, but there's actually not research to back it up. And so that kind of hung about in the back of my mind for years through clinical practice until finally I had the opportunity to do some research. And whilst I tried out other research ideas, that the unraveling the CTG story just I couldn't get it out of my head, so it became the focus of my PhD. And I finished the PhD and still had other things that I wanted to say and didn't want to have to wait for the very long cycle of academic publishing. So I set up my blog, Birth Small Talk, and started sharing it with, the audience out there on the internet, where I can decide on Friday that I'm writing a thing and have it published by the end of the day. And it's free and available for people. While that's useful, and I continue to post something most weeks, if you want to sit down and kind of study a logical story from beginning to end, then reading 400 blog posts is probably not the best use of your time. So I've started offering online education courses over time. So I've got one for women who are planning a vaginal birth after a cesarean section, and another more general one called Fetal Monitoring Informed Decisions for Your Birth, that just runs through the evidence for women. And I have one for people who are working in the system that's called the Fetal Monitoring Academy.
Right.
So those options now exist as an alternative to the kind of stuff that I was taught, and I still see health professionals being taught, which is a whole lot of wishful thinking rather than an actual deep understanding of what the evidence says.
You've raised a really great issue right off the bat around evidence, period. Evidence is always a work in progress. It's forever changing. There's nothing definitive when it comes to making decisions around the management of any pregnancy and the birth of a baby. And yet we try to pretend like that's not the case, that things are definitive. And one of the experiences that a lot of people discover when they're pregnant is how you'll get one doctor say one thing and another doctor say the exact opposite. And it helps you to realize that nothing is definitive when it comes to looking at what is the best way forward. So when
And
it
even if
yeah,
those two doctors, even if there's the one definitive study,
yeah,
the way that you interpret the significance of that and apply it,
yeah,
we're social beings. All of that work happens within the world in which we have lived, and the experiences that we've had always colour what we bring to it. And for people who are users of healthcare systems or providers of maternity care, that's true as well. If you're the parent of doctors who've grown up in a medical environment, your approach to how you are going to think about research and apply it is going to be very different to somebody whose mum was a home birth midwife.
yeah, exactly. So when it comes to protecting our babies and the idea of monitoring, what does the evidence tell us around the safest way to do that?
Okay. So for starters, the first question is, does listening to the baby's heart rate in any way,
Yeah,
whether you're actually listening or recording it visually as a heart rate tracing, is that better than not doing that at all during labour? And we don't know the answer to that question because no one's ever done that research.
wow.
And that's because of the historical trajectory. So doctors started listening to heart rates of babies during labour about 1830s.
Right.
And what we now recognise as research and the kind of things that would be done to design research that provides answers that you can be trusted and relied on in clinical setting, that's relatively new, and it happened much, much later than the introduction of listening to heart rates. So people just started doing it, and their decisions about what it meant and what to do about what they were hearing was very based on a lot of vibes
Right.
and belief systems, and that became the grounding of clinical practice. And then, of course, research started happening. But by then, like, why would you go back and research something that was already a fundamental part of people's approaches to care, and that everyone, in inverted commas, believed was essential and working? And because now we've reached a point where the mere thought of suggesting that you would study that has people feeling completely terrified. So you'd never get it past an ethics committee as an option to study. So we simply don't know the answer to that question. What we do have is research that compares the two main different ways to monitor the heart rate during labour, which is CTG monitoring and intermittent auscultation. So CTG monitoring, lots of people call it electronic fetal monitoring, but I'm a bit allergic to that term, involves recording data about the fetal heart rate, that's the cardio bit,
Yeah.
recording data about what's going on for the woman's uterus, that's the toco bit, and then plotting the two of those onto a graph, hence cardio-toco where you can see the change in the heart rate on the top line, the change in what's going on with the activity of the uterus on the bottom line. Modern systems now also put the mother's heart rate on there often, and that's plotted over time, so you can see how things change as labour unfolds. So that's CTGs. Intermittent auscultation involves using a device, and it doesn't specify which one, as long as it will do the job, to listen, auscultate intermittently. So it usually, most of the guidelines and the research have done things like listen for 60 seconds every 15 to 30 minutes, though that's, how that pans out in practice is quite variable for people. And, more often if you are concerned, more often if you're getting close to the baby arriving and you're out in the pushing stage of labour. And so initially the research that happened was of the kind where, in 1970 in our hospital, everyone had intermittent auscultation. And then in 1971, we bought a bunch of CTG machines. And in 1972, this is what happened. But of course, other things were going on at the same time. So they might simultaneously have introduced a neonatal intensive care unit for the first time. So, there's lots of other reasons why things might have improved over time in those kind of studies. So the best kind of research are what's called a randomized controlled trial, where they ask a group of women if they'll take part, and then they are randomly told, well, you're going to have CTG and you're going to have intermittent auscultation, and that's what they then get. And at the end of the labour, they then look to see what happened and who had what outcomes. And we have 11 of those that have been done. The earliest one was published in 1976. The most recent one was 2006, so it's almost 20 years old now. And most of it happened in the 1980s when I was a medical student. So it's old. Some of it's not great quality either ethically or in terms of the way the research was conducted. But it is what we have. It's the best that we have available to us. A process called meta-analysis is then used to smush the results of all of those individual studies into one great big pile so that you get the most amount of data to give the results that hopefully are, the most trustworthy that you can possibly have them be. So that's what's happened. There's a Cochrane review that's written by Alfirovic et al., published in 2017, that includes those studies. And in most parts of the world, particularly Australia, you can hop online, you can download the whole thing off the Cochrane library for free and read the entire thing. It's huge. It's like 100 pages long. But I'm not going to take you through it word by word.
Yeah.
The important messages that come out of reading that are that compared to using intermittent auscultation, CTG monitoring doesn't save babies' lives. The perinatal mortality rate was the same whether people were in the intermittent auscultation group or the CTG monitoring group. It doesn't prevent long-term brain damage. Cerebral palsy rates were also the same. It does lead to more use of caesarean section, both for reasons where people are concerned about the heart rate, but also for any reason at all. And the same applies for birth with the use of instruments, so vacuum and forceps. And as a consequence of that, the rate of births when women just push babies out their vaginas themselves is reduced when CTG monitoring is being used. In terms of baby outcomes, they've looked at APGAR scores and levels of acid in babies' blood and whether they needed resuscitation and whether they were admitted to the neonatal nursery, and if so, for how long. No differences in any of those things. The only area where there was a difference was in neonatal seizures, so babies having fits soon after birth that are presumed to be due a sign that there had been low oxygen during the labour. And that happened less often when CTG monitoring was used rather than intermittent auscultation. And it's a difference of 15 babies for every 10,000 births. So you need 667 women to have CTG monitoring to prevent one baby from having a seizure. So it's quite a lot.
Yeah.
Um, context is really important, and as I said, understanding where people are coming from and what their world was like and what was going on for them is part of being a good researcher and understanding how we got those numbers. And most of the research about neonatal seizures comes from one trial called the Dublin trial that was done in Dublin, and the births happened in the early 1980s, and they wrote a paper in 1985, and then their long-term follow-up happened that they wrote about in 89, 90. And they Dublin was the home of what was called active management of labour, which used quite a lot of oxytocin to make sure that women had babies within 12 hours of arriving at the hospital because they needed efficiency because they had such a large number of births and a relatively small workforce. And when you dig about in the fine print of the paper, and it's not an analysis that the authors themselves did and wrote up, but there's enough clues about it in some of the tables where they give numbers of what happened that I've been able to pull all the details out. When you look at women who did not have oxytocin used during their labour to speed their labour up or to have their labour induced, there was no difference in the seizure rate between CTG use and intermittent auscultation in both.
So, Kirsten, that's fascinating. What you're suggesting there is that the potential differentiation with this, the seizures could be more related to the use of syntocinon or synthetic oxytocin rather than the actual mode of monitoring. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's correct. The rate of seizures was much higher when oxytocin was used, regardless of which monitoring approach was in use. But the rate of seizures was less with CTG monitoring than it was with intermittent auscultation for the group where oxytocin was in use. But it's important to understand that the maternity care no longer looks like Dublin in the early 1980s.
Yeah.
And there's more information from another paper that was published from the same research group about the same time that gives some backstory about what care looked like. And one of the things that was going on was that part of the package of care that they provided was that every woman would have a care provider that stayed with them during their labour, which was a bit unusual for maternity care at the time, which was fabulous. But that person was almost always either a midwifery student or a medical student. And they were the person who was responsible for managing the oxytocin infusion. And they were also the person who was responsible for interpreting the CTG or performing the intermittent auscultation. And when they reached a point where they thought something was wrong, they would then go and get a midwife to come and interpret the situation. The other thing that differs is that infusion pumps did not exist. So nowadays we recognize the potential dangers of oxytocin. And when you give it, you dilute it in a bag of fluid and you run it through a machine that very specifically delivers exactly the number of mils per minute that you want it to. But in the days when I started as a medical student in the 1980s, what would happen was you would run it through the tubing and you would sit there and look closely at the little chamber where the drops were falling and adjust the stopcock up and down so that you had so many drops falling per minute. And it's not particularly reliable, which is why infusion pumps were invented, because there were all sorts of problems with either underdosing or overdosing, and you'd turn your back and realise that the entire thing had run through in an hour and it was supposed to last for 12, or some other catastrophe.
Wow.
So, like, what could possibly go wrong
Yeah.
in a maternity environment where the person who is taking responsibility for managing the manual adjustment of an IV infusion containing oxytocin is a bored medical student at 3 o'clock in the morning who doesn't want to bother the midwife who's in charge of the unit.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Uh,
that just doesn't happen today because we would recognise that that would be a completely inappropriate way to provide care. You would have a registered health professional, usually a midwife, in
mm,
the room with you mostly all of the time, and the medications would be delivered through a syringe pump. And we can see the impact of that because
mm,
when you look at the rate of seizures that was happening in the group who had oxytocin and who had a CTG, it was 36 per 10,000 births.
yeah.
The ARRIVE trial that some of your listeners might be familiar
Mm,
with, which is the one that looked at should we induce labour early versus later for women having their first baby over the age of 35.
yeah.
When you read the fine print of their trial, so all of those women that in the early induction group were basically all of them were being induced. So almost all of them will have been exposed to oxytocin and they will have had CTG monitoring because it was standard practice. In that group, the chance of having a baby having neonatal seizures was not 36 per 10,000, it was 8.
Right.
So the the way we deliver care is completely different, and that's what's changed the outcomes, not the use of the CTG machine.
Right.
So I see professional bodies regularly pull out but it prevents seizures part of the story as proof that if we just tried a bit harder and did slightly bigger research and used better machines and had better educated practitioners, then we'd be able to prove that it also prevented long-term brain injury and it also prevented deaths. And that argument doesn't wash for me, particularly not in the current era in high income healthcare systems that have pretty sound approaches to their care.
Mm,
But what we do know is that it makes a difference to the way that women give birth and how babies are born. And of course, in the time since the early 1980s, the caesarean section rate has gone from 3%, which is what it was in the Dublin trial,
mm,
to well over 30 into the 40% and sometimes higher, depending where you are in the
yeah.
world range. And while there are lots of reasons that that's happened, the expansion of CTG monitoring and the additional technologies that are now layered on top of and alongside of that
Mm,
play a very large role in having driven that rise. And it hasn't translated into better outcomes. And in the most recent stats that have come out this year, which relate to births that happened in 2023, have actually shown that we're going backwards, and that the stillbirth rate has actually increased.
mm. That's very interesting. So, for those listening, and maybe you've been told you need to be induced, maybe you've been told that you need to have monitoring for a certain reason, what Kirsten's really alluding to is the evidence between continuous monitoring and intermittent monitoring isn't sound in terms of outcomes. It doesn't show that it's having better outcomes for mothers and babies. In fact, it's leading to more interventions. One of the things you need to realize when you agree to be continuously monitored is it can have a huge impact on your ability to intuitively respond to the needs of your labor. Women who are free to move and respond to their labor typically choose positions, find ways of comfort that support the actual process of the birth at that particular time. There's an intelligence to the body. And when we interfere with that and we hook women up, we keep them on beds, we limit their ability to respond, then it comes at a cost. So, Kirsten, for women who've been told that they need to be monitored continuously, what would
Mm.
your suggestion be in light of what you've just shared with us?
I'd ask some more questions. Why are you making that recommendation.
Hmm.
And I'd certainly advise that you watch out for the use of language like need, require, must have, mandatory, because none of that's true. The use of any intervention in labour requires a woman's consent. It's a human rights issue. So
Right.
nobody can actually require, need, force, mandate that you have to use a particular approach to fetal monitoring. A decision must be made about which approach is going to be used, and you, by rights, should be the decision maker. What more commonly happens in practice, though, is the way that it is worded implies that you don't have a choice.
Mm.
So you may encounter things like, just pop up on the bed and lie down and I'll get the monitoring attached for you.
Yeah. Like
Not
that's a
is it,
choice.
not is it okay if I put you
Yeah.
onto the CTG monitor at this particular point in time?
Mm.
Or the other can be true for intermittent auscultation as well. I'm just going to have a quick listen to your baby with the Doppler before you hop into the shower.
Mm.
Um, and so being able to recognize that what's happened is that somebody has made a decision about which form of fetal monitoring they're about to use for you, and that person was not you, and you have the right to make that decision. You can then step in and go and slow them down a little bit. Hang on a minute. Sorry, are you talking about CTG monitoring here?
Mm.
And why are you suggesting that I have that? And can you give us a moment to discuss what we'd like to do? If you just need a bit of space, hopefully you've figured this out during the pregnancy so that you're ready, and it's not the first time you've heard about it when you're already in labour.
Yeah.
Um, and you can then say, actually, I've decided to use intermittent auscultation, thanks. So there's no need for the CTG to go on,
Mm.
or whatever, whatever people decide that they want to use at that particular point in time. And if you are, I mean, I can't tell you how every health practitioner is going to behave in terms of you making a statement about what you're going to have for your labour, but I do find that when you are clear in your soul about the fact that I'm the decision maker here and what I say goes, and
Mm.
you communicate it clearly with people and say, I'm going to use this, that you are more likely to encounter an, oh, okay then, response. If you sit on the fence slightly and you are looking for somebody's approval for your decision, and so you word it as, well, I thought I might like to use intermittent auscultation. What do you think?
Yeah.
You've lost the battle because
Yeah.
you've just opened up a new conversation, and they will then talk you into what it is that they wanted you to be using in the first place.
Mm.
Because there's this huge misbelief. Like I had it too as an obstetrician. It took me years of working as a specialist obstetrician before that couple went, show us the evidence. And I went,
Sure.
there is none. Like, how did I not know this? No one told me that there was no evidence. And that's still largely the issue in maternity
Mm.
services in Australia, is that the people you encounter genuinely, wholeheartedly are good people who believe that what they're doing is a good thing
Yeah.
to do because they
Yeah.
don't know the evidence. They haven't looked at the research themselves. They haven't been taught about it. So you may, hopefully you've got somebody who's done one of my courses and knows the evidence and goes, that's fabulous. Let's use intermittent auscultation, and is happy to back in behind you. But you may encounter some resistance. And that can range from some pretty shoddy behaviour. What, do you want your baby to die?
Yeah.
um, or trying to recruit your partner into, stepping in and taking over the decision making. Lots of, well, if it was my baby, or if you had seen what I had seen in practice, then you would know that, what you're doing is a bad idea. Um, and all of that stuff it's not okay. It's coercive. It's against every professional standard for any registered health practitioner to be behaving in that way, and is not
Yeah.
okay. But
Yeah.
it still does happen.
Mm.
And so again, recognizing that that is not appropriate behavior for your professional to be engaging in is part of the solution here. And your options might be to find a different provider if that's what you're going to be encountering at each of your visits and throughout your labour. You may or may not have much control over who your care provider is, but if you do, then finding somebody that's not going to be telling you the baby's going to die if you make a decision is a good choice for you. Not giving up in advance is also part of it. And I think as women, we've often been socialized to be the peacekeepers and to keep people around us comfortable and happy. And so when we anticipate that what we're about to ask for might cause discomfort for our care provider, we might change what we want to do.
Yeah.
And you need to recognize that that's what's going on and remind yourself that it's actually not your job to manage the emotional response of your care provider to your plan for your birth. That's their job.
Yeah.
They've got to look after their emotions. Your job is to make a decision that works for you and to communicate it clearly with people and communicate that you expect that decision is honoured. Your job is also not to provide them with education. And I often get people contacting me saying, oh, can you provide me with some papers that prove XYZ that I can give to my doctor? Because at the moment they're recommending that I have CTG monitoring. And while I'm more than happy to furnish people with the evidence, and usually I've written a blog post about it and could just give them the link, it's actually not your job to teach your health professional what the evidence says. And it won't change their mind anyway, because the thing that's making them behave that way is a whole set of policies and guidelines and working instructions and that are in place in their organisation that tell them that that's what they have to do.
Yeah.
So introducing them to what the evidence says is not going to change their behaviour. It's just going to exhaust you. So, if you want the information for yourself because you're still not quite sure about how you want to weigh stuff up, then by all means, go and have a hunt through what's on the blog, because you'll find I've covered most things there over the last couple of years. But don't feel like it's your job to be educating your care provider. That's their responsibility.
So one of the things I give my families is a whole lot of questions to ask their health providers in order to find out what the ground rules are where they're birthing and how they're going to approach this. Things like, under what conditions would you absolutely need to do a vaginal examination, or when would you want me on my back? And one of the other ones is under what conditions would you want to do continuous monitoring? What would your answer be to that, Kirsten? Is there ever a time when continuous monitoring might be really appropriate?
When the woman asks for it. That's the only one I can think of.
So there's no...
When the woman has made her own mind up that that's what she wants to do.
Yeah, that's
I cannot find any compelling proof in the research of any specific situation in which CTG monitoring improves outcomes. As I said, the closest that we can get is that stuff about oxytocin use, and it's 40-year-old research that comes from a world that doesn't exist anymore because we do care differently. So it probably doesn't apply anymore. Mind you, that the issue, of course, is that if you said, I'd like to be induced and I'm going to have intermittent auscultation, then you are not going to find a care provider who will be prepared to start an oxytocin infusion.
Yeah.
So if you want to be induced, you're going to have to buy into the entire package of care, part of which is to have continuous monitoring. And the other interventions like accessing an epidural, you might get the same response. Well, we're not doing that unless you agree to this. And then if you particularly want that, they can refuse to provide it to you unless they feel that there's safety measures in place. So it gets a little bit tricky when it's one
Mm.
thing to talk about the theoretical, what the research says, but applying
Yeah.
that in the real world does sometimes involve some um, navigation and collaboration in terms of getting to a final point of agreement. Um, I, I had an interesting conversation with a midwife in Ireland a couple of years ago when I was teaching over there, and she said she was very proudly said, "Well, I only use CTGs when they're really needed." And I said, "Well, tell me what you think that means. What do you mean by really needed?" She said, "Well, if I hear something with the Doppler when I'm doing intermittent auscultation, and I think that the heart rate is abnormal, that's when I would put a CTG on." And I said, "Did you know that in the many of the trials that looked at the use of the two forms of monitoring in populations of women who are considered to be at high risk, one of the entry criteria that got you into the study was if the heart rate sounded abnormal on intermittent auscultation. And 50% of those women were randomized to intermittent auscultation. So in fact, there's no evidence that when you hear an abnormal heart
Yeah.
rate that putting the CTG on will improve things, which actually makes logical sense. Like, it is the same heart rate.
Yeah.
They're the same patterns that people are looking out for. So if you do intermittent auscultation and respond to the abnormal pattern in the same way that you would if you had a machine recording it onto a computer in the corner, why would you expect the outcomes to be different?
Mm. Interesting.
It's not some kind of
Yeah.
magical fancy crystal thing that's going to suddenly change outcomes. It's um yeah, it doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
But in the practicalities of the real world, it really is about negotiating with your care provider about if you don't want intervention, that's a bit easier
Mm.
because they can't withdraw an intervention that you want on the basis that you haven't agreed to CTG use. But if you do want a specific intervention, like an induction or like an epidural, then you may find that it's not on offer
Mm.
if you choose intermittent auscultation as well. So that's something that is really important to have that conversation well in advance,
Yeah.
so that you can sort that out. The other thing that is increasingly important in particularly bigger hospitals, not so much in regional and rural places around Australia, is asking the question, does this hospital use central fetal monitoring? Because you may not be told that in advance and you may not even be aware of it unless you know the signs of what to watch for. So what that is, originally, CTGs printed out onto a piece of paper, and if somebody wanted to see that, they had to walk into the space where the piece of paper was, or somebody had to remove the piece of paper and go and take it to the person who wanted to look at it. So as the woman who's having the monitoring done, you would know when that person was looking at that piece of paper or when somebody was facilitating somebody else looking at it because it was happening in front of you. And when people have to walk into the birth room, it means that they become aware of what's happening in the birth room. Like, they can tell if the baby's been born already.
Mm.
They can tell what sounds people are making. If they're there for more than just a red hot moment, they'll know roughly what's going on with contraction patterns. And typically, the person who's the frontline care provider, the midwife, will be there as well and can say, well, this is what's going on, and her observations were. What's now happened is that the data has been digitized, which means you can move it. So you can pick that data up and you can display it on a screen somewhere miles away. An obstetrician can be lying in their bed at night and they can pick up their mobile phone and they can pull up your CTG on the screen and they can look at it. And they don't know what's going on in your room. They can just see the heart rate and they can see your contractions, and they can then come to a conclusion about what they think is going on based on that. Many bigger units are now installing systems where somewhere in a central location, and that's why it's called central fetal monitoring, there'll be a bank of computers that display the CTG tracing of every single woman who is currently having a CTG inside the birth suite. So, the woman in room 6 is being induced, and the woman who's having baby number 6 is in room 7, and the woman who's got having the twins over there in room 5. Every single one of them will have their CTGs up on the screen so that one person can sit there and look at them all. And again, they don't know exactly what's going on inside the birth room. And so there are some issues with that because it means that you've lost control over your personal private health information, and anyone who wants to wander into that space can access it, which may or may not be a concern to you.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a doctor that you don't want involved in your care, and you have no control over whether they walk into there and say to the team leader, "Hey, you've got to get in there because that's not okay," and suddenly they're dictating your care, and you don't even know that that's happening. The hospital cleaner and the wardie and the med students and the midwifery students, and I think that's a problem.
Mm.
Um, and the fact that people are not told in advance that that's the standard of care, and there's no way you can actually have a choice over it. And almost everywhere, you will not have the control over it. If the CTG is on, your data will be visible in that room, and you can't choose to turn it on or off and have that under your control. My PhD specifically looked at a problem that had happened in a hospital where central fetal monitoring had been introduced a couple of years previously. And that was the situation where people out at the central monitoring station would see something on the CTG and go, "Oh no!" And they would go rushing up the corridor, slam in through doors, sometimes very spectacularly and without knocking and being polite about it, and burst into rooms going, "Oh my word, have you seen what's going on with the CTG?" And sometimes the baby had already been born, and what they were seeing was not actually a great big deceleration. It was the baby arriving, and now there's not a heart rate to pick up because the monitor's still on the woman's belly and the baby's in her arms. Um, Sometimes, the woman would be on the toilet trying to do a poo, and the monitor would slip, and suddenly she'd have somebody come rushing in, staring at her while she's sitting on the loo trying to do a poo.
Mm.
Or she'd be in the midst of having a vaginal examination done, or, just really inappropriate invasions of people's privacy.
Yeah.
And even when it was quite polite, which it was sometimes, when, you'd have somebody who would gently, quietly walk up the corridor and tap quietly on the door and wait for the midwife to open it and say, "Can I just ask you about your CTG?" It still meant that that midwife had to stop what she was doing,
Mm.
he, in figuring out themselves what was going on with the CTG and doing the things that needed to happen in response to it, to deal with the need of the person at the door for information and anxiety reduction.
Mm. And then the
And so then
chain of,
they're not doing the things that they need to be doing to
yeah,
support that woman to address
that's
that
right.
particular problem, because they're having to manage the emotional needs of somebody who's sitting and watching the CTG from outside the room.
Mm.
So if any of you have given birth and you've ever had the experience of suddenly having somebody inexplicably turn up in your room wanting to know something about what's going on with the CTG,
Yeah.
that's because you were giving birth in a hospital that had central fetal monitoring.
Yeah.
And so midwives are now finding that what they need actually is not escalation skills, that they don't need to know about how to go and get help. They need de-escalation
De-escalation.
skills so they can go, "Stop, back off,
Mm.
it's fine, I have this under control." And
Yeah.
that's an entirely different skill set. And it's not one that I think we're teaching particularly well for new midwives.
And the chain of command gets more complicated because you've got other people weighing in to decision making that can be happening that aren't even in the room.
Correct. And they don't necessarily have the full picture of
Mm.
information. And
Mm.
sometimes when I was interviewing midwives, one of the things they were concerned about was that um, when you're looking at a bank of CTGs at the same time without all of the information attached to that, there might be a CTG which actually wasn't particularly abnormal, and another one that looked really bad at the central monitoring station. But the really bad one was a term baby in a woman who's having baby number 4, and it's rocketing out and it's going to be born in 5 minutes.
Mm.
And the one that was only slightly a little bit abnormal was a 32-week baby with growth restriction who's being induced because mum's got severe preeclampsia and she's 1 centimetre dilated.
Mm. Yeah.
Who needs more intervention?
Yes.
Who's going to have a baby in the next 5 minutes?
Yeah.
But who's going to get the attention? The
Mm.
one who has the spectacular looking CTG.
Yeah.
So you're losing that extra information because you're out at the desk is a problem, and you can't see that it's happening when you're that person.
Mm.
Part of what I did during my data collection was to spend time in the central monitoring space, watching people as they made use of the information in the central monitoring area. And there would be quite long times, up to 40 minutes, where there would be nobody there, is one of the things. So it's not necessarily true that, if your midwife is busy doing something else, someone else is looking, because that's not
Yeah.
always the case. Um, and during those times, my obstetrician brain could not help itself, and it began to make up stories. And so I would kind of go, wonder who's going to be the next person who gives birth. And you'd look at kind of clues on the CTG to try and predict who was going to have a baby next. And it was usually wrong. But that's going through the minds of all of the people who are sitting looking at that data as well, is that they're making up
Mm.
stories that make sense to them on the basis of
Yeah.
what they can see, not what's really happening.
And in my training, I remember we were also schooled in recognizing the problem with interpretation and the incredible what's normal for one baby could be very different for what's normal for another. And the decision making that gets made on top of all of that tends to lead down the path of high rates of intervention and cesarean sections and things.
Mm.
So, for a pregnant woman who's navigating their antenatal sessions and their classes and they're taking in all of this information and they're doing their best to get clear on what are the things that they would consider and be open to and what are the things that are not negotiable for them. What sort of advice would you give them in their preparation period, Kirsten, to be able to navigate what I would suggest is a very significant decision if you choose to go ahead with continuous monitoring?
Yeah, don't miss doing some background education on fetal monitoring, because a lot of people don't think about it and assume that the clinical practice is aligned with the evidence and the evidence is settled, which is far from the case. And people will spend a whole lot more time thinking about, what should I do for placental birth, and what should I do for for infant feeding.
Yeah.
But everyone who's giving birth with a registered health practitioner will have to face the question of, unless they're having a pre-labor cesarean section, what are you going to do for fetal monitoring? And it can have a profound effect on outcomes and your experiences of your birth. If you have something that you don't actively consent to being involved in, that then kind of backs you into a corner that you can't get back out of, and takes away your power and authority to be in charge of what happens during your birth. So go find good, reliable evidence sources, and you're more than welcome to come and find birthsmalltalk.com. I always include the references to the research and hyperlinks so that you can actually go and get to the original papers as well. Not all of them are freely available, but you'll at least get to an abstract. Um, do have conversations with your care provider. Ideally, you should be working with a care provider who's going to be there for you during your labour and birth, so that you don't have to deal with having a rank stranger turn up when you're in labour and you've got to start all over again. So getting into a continuity of care up model is a good way to help make sure that once you've settled on something and talked to somebody about it, you don't have to do that all over again. And again at the next shift change, and again at the next shift change. Put it down on paper. and make sure that your support people are in on the secret as well, so that, if you literally can't talk for yourself, then somebody else can step in and do that. And be prepared to have some plan Bs and plan Cs, because, maybe you'll set out to have intermittent auscultation, uh, and then, ultimately choose to have an epidural put in, and you just don't want somebody having to physically touch you every 15 minutes because you'd really like a nap right now. And so having
Yeah.
the CTG on so that you can sleep for 3 or 4 hours might actually be quite lovely.
Yeah.
Um, maybe you'll find the intermittent auscultation incredibly disruptive and intrusive, and having something continuously attached might actually feel better for you. You won't know until you were there.
Mm.
So having some, having a plan A, but then some ideas about, well, if it isn't what I had expected it would be, or if something changes in my birth from what I have planned, what is it that I want to do as my next option?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and as I said, know what's available in the place where you intend to give birth. About things like, is there a central fetal monitoring system? Do you have access to telemetry? So wireless CTG monitoring, that means that you're not physically tethered to the CTG machine with a cord,
Yeah.
and ideally waterproof wireless monitoring, so that, if you did choose to have a CTG, you could still be in the bath or the shower. If that's not available, then
Mm.
if you want to use the bath or the shower, then you're having intermittent auscultation, or you're not having a bath or a shower.
Yeah.
So yeah, know
Could you
know
just
what's available.
tell us a little bit about scalp monitors?
Okay. People call them scalp clips, which is a misnomer because it's not like a clothes peg that clips on. I use the term fetal spiral electrode because it gives you some clues about what's really going on. And it doesn't have to be on the scalp, because if you've got a baby that's breech, you can actually use them on a bum as well, strictly speaking.
Right.
So it's a small um, metal wire, that gets hooked through the surface of the baby's skin, scalp or buttock. That And then a wire that goes from that little attachment point along the woman's vagina. It gets attached to a leg plate, usually a little thing that gets strapped around the thigh, and then either wirelessly or through another connection goes back to the CTG machine, and it collects the information about the electrical impulses that are generated each time the baby's heart beats, so it can count up the heart rate. They do make it more likely that you will capture every single heartbeat
Mm-hmm.
than an externally worn monitor, where if the baby changes position, it won't be underneath the sensor anymore and you can not hear the heart rate, or it can, flip over or move if you're moving. If you've got water drumming against the back of it, if you're in the bath or the shower, it can interfere with the signal. So it does improve the ability to detect every single heartbeat. So I
Mm.
would argue that knowing that actually won't make a difference to people's ability to tell whether there's a problem or not. They do have some risks. You are piercing the skin, so it does cause trauma, and sometimes there's more damage than others. It introduces a potential point for infection to enter the system. So in some women, if people have HIV or hepatitis B or hepatitis C, or some other vaginal infection or genital infection, it's advised that you don't use them because it increases the rate of transmission to the baby.
Mm-hmm.
And in situations where people don't have an obvious infection, there are still bacteria inside vagina, that can then be introduced into the baby through its skin into the bloodstream. So there are higher rates of infection for babies where scalp electrodes have been used, and higher rates of infection for women because they've also had things put through their vaginas and stuff done that wouldn't be done otherwise. There are some fairly horrendous case reports of scalp electrodes being screwed into eyes, or one where I don't know, I just cannot imagine how it happened, but somebody screwed it into an umbilical cord, causing the baby to bleed to death.
Oh.
Um, they're fortunately rare, but care providers should know exactly where it is that they're putting the tip of the thing, and it should be have bone underneath it and not soft tissue that can be easily damaged. Um, there's there's never been a randomized control trial that has looked at whether using an externally worn heart rate sensor versus a fetal spiral electrode improves outcomes, makes outcomes worse, changes the cesarean section rate. We don't know. No one's ever done that research,
Right.
which is fascinating. Like, what they're quite commonly used. So why would you not get around to doing that? So there's a part of the reason why it's never been done is there's just an assumption that, well, it's just the same but better. Why would we need to actually even go and prove it in research?
Mm.
Which I don't think is a legitimate argument that holds true. So yeah, some women find them useful because it's the least amount of wiggling, poking, and jiggling. Once it's on, it's pretty much set and forget. And if you don't want people poking, prodding, rearranging things, and if you want to get rid of a strap around your belly, then it can achieve that.
Mm.
But it certainly isn't the solution to preventing poor outcomes that
Right.
it is often presented as.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kirsten. You've covered a lot in today's podcast around this really important topic. It can seem like a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you want to monitor? But I think what Kirsten's helped us to see is that there's a lot of good reasons, actually, why you wouldn't want to necessarily go down that path. And certainly under what conditions you might be encouraged to go down that path. But having conversations with your care providers, choosing care providers that will listen, that will respect your choice. It is a human right. Kirsten made that point beautifully. And I think it's always important to remember your body, your baby, your birth, your choice. It's law. It has to be that way. And it's important for us as consumers of these wonderful safety nets, these places called hospitals that most of us like to give birth in, that we recognize that it's important to step up and become a part of the decision making when it comes to any type of care within our birth setting. I want to thank you, Kirsten, for spending this time with us today. Is there anything you'd like to finish off with and let people know how they can contact you?
The blog is birthsmalltalk.com. It's easy to find, and you'll find some details about me and how to get in contact with me if you do want to reach out and ask a question or make a comment about something. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and now Blue Sky, and all of those are at Birth Small Talk. So you can come and find me on the socials as well, and see what I'm up to over there.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time today. And my darling families, we'll see you again next fortnight. Take care. Bye.